morning to you all, and thank you for coming. I'm very honored to introduce you to Herman van der Werfhorst, who is now at the European University Institute, where he holds the chair in sociology. He's also the coordinator of interdisciplinary research cluster on inequality, welfare, and social justice. And he's on leave from the University of Amsterdam, when he is professor since 2007 and chair of the sociology department. Herman is very well known. He's a leading scholar in social stratification. He has published in numerous well-known top journals in the area of sociology, demography, social stratification in Europe and in the United States. But he's also a leader, like an academic leader. He dynamizes research groups and academic activities. And I think that many of the current well-known researchers were once in the area were once your PhD students. So his work has mainly dealt with the interaction between education and inequality, mostly with the effect of systems of education on different paths in educational paths, just prospects of civil involvement. But he is also currently doing other things. He's currently doing two research projects, and one of them is on an adolescence panel study focusing on democratic core values and school careers. And this is related to the interest that he holds here in the study of political values that he has explained to me that is a really old interest. So welcome, Herman, and looking forward to your presentation. Yeah, I should give you. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you very much also for the invitation to be here. It's really nice to be back at UPF. I was here last autumn in September at the ECSR conference, and I've also been here a couple of times presenting earlier work, also in this room, I think, actually. And it's always a great pleasure to be here. Today, I will present work that is collaborative work with three political scientists. I'm a sociologist. I strongly identify as a sociologist, and but these are good friends of mine and from political science. I've always tried to cross boundaries in all kinds of ways, across fields, economics, political science, educational studies, and sociology. And this particular paper is a product of this collaboration with political scientists. These are all from the University of Amsterdam, where I was before, and this is a paper that has been going on for a long time. And for a long time, the title of the paper stopped at political orientation or political values in the previous title. So in the program too, I think there was not the word voting, but in fact we've done some interesting additional analysis that are about voting, and maybe I concentrate most of my talk on that today. So this is about the education-vote relationship and how to make sense of that from political values perspective or political orientation perspective. That's the broader, let's say, background of the paper. So these political scientists are in Amsterdam. We've worked on this in a comparative perspective. So we look at comparative data. The project that Luis just mentioned that I'm involved with about democratic values is a Dutch panel study. So I'm also looking at these political orientations in the Dutch context with panel data. And I've for a long time been involved in trying to combine interests in stratification and political orientation or civic engagement more broadly. And the reason for that I will explain in a second. So if I think of my own work, it is comparative, and I try to understand how educational systems vary across societies and how it affects all kinds of inequalities. And when it comes to democratic outcomes, there might be a difference with, let's say, labor market outcomes. When it comes to labor market outcomes, some level of inequality is tolerated by many of us, and some form of stratification is in fact legitimate, but it's much harder to think of this in terms of political inequalities as legitimate. So there's different, let's say, areas of justice theory about different types of different realms of life, and in the political sphere it is very hard to imagine a legitimation of inequalities on the basis of educational attainment, unlike, for instance, when it comes to wages or labor market outcomes. So that contrast between democratic equality and meritocratic inequality is something that I think is at the heart of understanding inequalities. Inequalities that we might legitimize in all kinds of ways, might come with inequalities that at the same time we don't legitimize in all kinds of ways. So that's why I think we should think of these outcomes, labor markets, stratification outcomes, and political outcomes in the form of trade-offs. You might gain something if an educational system does well in producing, let's say, those skills that create labor market progression and maybe even with some level of inequality. And at the same time, that might come at a cost by enlarging differences in political participation by education groups. So that's my broader background of being interested in political outcomes. In educational or in the political sciences, education has become really a new cleavage. It's really hot and happening as we speak in political science to study educational gaps in political orientation and values and membership of organizations, etc. In replacement of social class. Whether this is indeed true, whether this is a trend that we see that education gets more important is an empirical question that I will partly address. But it's definitely high on the agenda. And it was very nice to see that Gary Marks and Lisbeth Hoge, two political scientists from, I think North Carolina, they've replicated my PhD thesis of 25 years ago in the US, measuring types of skills that people get in education and how that relates to political outcomes. So it's really hot and happening. I get requests to visit me, people want to visit the EUI with a political science background, way more than sociologists. So it's really apparently clearly an important study topic. And when it comes to political values or political orientations, a very common distinction these days, or since quite some time already, is between economic and cultural issues, or traditional left-right kind of orientations with regard to income redistributions, the involvement of the state in addressing inequalities, and on the other hand, these more cultural values of environmental orientations, gender, maybe immigration, and those topics of politics are typically more culturally oriented and are typically better predicted by education. So I also try to address this difference between economic and cultural values. We've seen a lot of polarization happening in many societies, and one question, I guess, is whether this is about education. Is education the main driver of this polarization? I think if you look at a lot of the American political science literature, this is definitely what is the conclusion, although the conclusion seems to be a bit more nuanced with the latest American elections, because education was in fact not so good a predictor as it was in the previous election. Okay, now let's get a bit more specific about what we do. So one could say that there is a political participation or political polarization paradox, meaning that we think that polarization is happening. We think that groups are different, are more and more against each other in all kinds of ways. But when we look at political orientations by education groups, we don't really see a lot of polarization. We don't see a trend in the sense that education better predicts values than it used to do. So if education was the main driver of polarization, one would expect that education, in fact, increasingly predicts values and increasingly orients people to a certain political orientation that might then be contrasted with other education groups. But that's not the case. So that's, one could say, a paradox. It's everywhere in the media and in public knowledge, but it's not really hard, it's not easy to address, to find it empirically. And there's been a couple of studies, couple of approaches to address this issue. The first one is that maybe elites that we see in the media are more polarized than the public. And that's in fact quite well documented. So when you look at political elites, political leaders, politicians, they are simply more polarized on all kinds of issues than the public is. So then if that's what ends up in the media, we might have a misconception, so to say, of what is the level of polarization in society. Second, there's been a realignment across topics. So people have opinions about all kinds of different topics: environment, income redistribution, gender, immigration, refugees. You could think of all kinds of topics. And increasingly one can predict one's orientation in one domain by knowing what is the orientation on another domain. So there's an increasing realignment of political orientation. You get basically the whole package more and more these days compared to before, let's say, 20, 30 years ago, when political orientations could be more, let's say, left-leaning on the environment, but still more right-leaning on immigration, for instance. So you can, and of course, if that happens, if the package becomes more like one package that, that classifies individuals in terms of their orientation, one could imagine that is also some sign of polarization. Because then at least you know that, if you know somebody's opinion about immigration, you now know also that person's opinion on the environment, let's say, or income redistributions. So this realignment across topics has been nicely demonstrated by Baldassari and Bierman in the AJS, I think, in 2009. Another more political science contribution is the affective versus attitudinal polarization. So even if polarization is not so much happening with regard to the values that people have, there is an increasing polarization with regard to not liking the other personally. So there's a affective polarization that is getting stronger in the. So if you know somebody's political opinion, you might dislike the other person, so to say, that has a different opinion than you, as a person, more than it used to be. And that could be another way that we tend to see polarization, even if in value studies we don't really see. Another contribution, again, by Baldassari, who did interesting work on this, says that we have an increasingly homogeneous bubble when it comes to educational attainment. So our networks are more homogeneous than they used to be when it comes to educational attainment. And because we just get then informed about what people's opinions are, but now we get a very homogeneous, let's say, source of information about what other people's opinions are, we might think there is more homogenization, but it's just a construction of the networks that are more homogeneous, even if the values themselves by individuals are not more polarized. So that's another contribution in that field. And we basically say there's another contribution possible that is somewhat related to these kinds of approaches, but has its own merit. And that is that we should not only look at mean differences across groups, education groups, when it comes to values, but also that within group homogeneity. So if an education group gets more similar across time, or is more similar in a certain context, that is a more polarized system compared to a system where the dispersion within groups is much wider and you have lots more variation within education categories in what people think about climate or redistribution, etc. So we should look at mean differences and within group homogeneity. And we've come up with this metaphor of gaps and trenches. Gaps refer to the mean difference, higher education versus lower education groups, what is their value, what is their orientation. And the trenches are the depth of the trenches. Small dispersions mean deep trenches. You can't get out of the trench, basically, right? That's the metaphor that we use for this. So we should look at gaps and trenches. Just as a matter of illustration, the letters are very small here, but these are two distributions. On the x-axis, there's a political value, and the y-axis is some sort of density measure. And you see two distributions of two hypothetical situations, contexts, countries, time periods, whatever you want. And you see that these graphs have exactly the same mean difference between two education groups. The dotted line are the college-educated population, and the solid line is the high school dropouts. So these groups have the same mean difference. If you look at the mean of these distributions, they're identical. The mean difference is identical between these two graphs. However, what differs is that in the lower graph, you see a much smaller within-group variance. And that means that you also see there's no overlap in orientations across education groups. Whereas here, there's overlap between the education groups in terms of the distribution. So we should look at gaps, the difference in the means, and the trenches, the depth of the trench, let's say, the within-group heterogeneity or homogeneity. Right? That's the main question. That's about political orientations. And the next step is then to relate those patterns to the education-vote relationship. So how well does education predict which party people vote for? Okay. So the analysis consists of two different steps. First, we want to document over time trends and between country variations in the level of polarization in terms of gaps and trenches. So what is the trend in the gaps between higher and lower educated individuals in terms of all kinds of political values and orientations. And what are the trenches over time and across countries in those orientations? Do we see a trend towards more polarization in those trenches, meaning that the variances get smaller within groups compared to before, as another sign of polarization that has thus far not been investigated? The second question is then, does that value pattern in terms of gaps and trenches structurate the education-vote relationship? Do we see that the association between education and the party that people vote for, Green Party, traditional left party, right party, radical right party, whether that association between education and the vote can be predicted by the extent to which there are gaps and trenches in political orientations? Those are the main research questions. So I'll go through this result in referring to these two steps. First, I start with step 1, documenting the trend and the differences across countries in gaps and trenches. And secondly, go to the vote analysis. This idea has been problematized before, actually. We were already deep into writing this paper then when I came across this nice paper by Paul DiMaggio and colleagues in 1996, where they look at distributions in all kinds of ways in American public opinion data. So they basically say that we should look at trends in dispersions also, not only trends and means, within groups. And their groups consisted of all kinds of things, not only education, but also racial groups, age groups, urban, rural. So polarization is about the extremity of and the distance between responses, as they say it. They have a very nice citation that I just want to read out because it's really inspirational in a way. We regard two groups as polarized in a manner likely to lead to intergroup conflict only to the extent that A, between group differences are substantial, and B, within group polarization is minimal. Polarization is a matter of both gaps and trenches, you could say. In fact, I've done similar analysis before when I looked into the political orientation of professors and other professionals in the BJS some years ago. There was all debate going on about universities being exclusionary to right-wing scholars. It was impossible for non-left-wing scholars to find a job in universities and feel comfortable there or whatever it is. And I thought that's also a matter of gaps and trenches, without calling it that way. So I wanted to know whether the mean differences between professors and other professionals are there, and also whether the professors are more homogeneous with regard to all kinds of orientations, as you would expect if the university was some sort of a right-wing left-wing bastion that excludes right-wing scholars. I didn't find any evidence of that, actually. So there was a mean difference. Professors are more left-leaning than many other professionals and managers. But the homogeneity was just as large or just as small, let's say, as it was in other professional groups. So professions might structurate orientations, that's possible, or select on them, whatever it is. But it's not like the professors were outstanding in their homogeneity compared to other professions. So that thinking has been with me for some time now. Just to graphically illustrate the main interest in the vote association. So this is the party people vote for in a certain country, in a certain time period. And education is a predictor of that. And that strength of that association between education and vote is moderated by the gaps that might be there in educational orientation, political orientation between education groups, and the trenches in political values within education groups. So that's the second part of the analysis. So how do we do that? So first we look at the trends in the gaps and trenches in two different ways. We started out with ISSP because it has a longer term trend. It goes back to 1985. We pulled all the ISSP surveys in which you have education and you have all kinds of political orientations. It gives us 52 countries in the Americas, Europe, Asia, Oceania, and Africa. It's really wide coverage of countries. And secondly, we did the same thing with European social survey data, which go back much shorter, only since 2002. But the good thing about the European social survey is that it notes the vote that people have, so we know what people voted for So for that second part of the analysis, we need to resort to the ESS data, meaning that we also have shorter trends in that kind of design. So the second part of the analysis is just based on ESS, basically. We're still wondering whether ISSP should stay in the paper, because the more we work on it, the more it becomes about the vote relationship. And then ISSP might be useful to put in a different paper or in an appendix or something. So any suggestions you have in that regard would be appreciated, because we're still writing it up. So how do we measure trends in polarization in terms of gaps and trenches? Basically, we use what is called heterogeneity regression techniques. So we estimate simply first a regression model that predicts the mean. We do in regression models. So we have the mean outcome, some value orientation. That's a function of variables, education, country, time, etc. And that has a residual variance in the so the residuals of that model has a variance, right? So in that particular context, we know what is the residual, what is the unpredicted part of the model, right? So how much variation is there within groups, so to say. Because we have X in the model, this residual variance is after the model, so this is within group variance, right? So that variance is then estimated in a second step by a certain level of predictors, and we have the same predictors here. So Z is the same as X, also education, also country, also time, and we know basically what is the residual, of that model, and how strongly is residual correlated to education. Yes. No. Not quite. It's the within group that you have defined in your X that could still vary. Everybody has a residual that is different from model prediction, and that residual could be dependent on your variables. In that case, yeah, in a non-causal understand. So, and the variance is then estimated with the same predictors. So basically, we have variation across time and place and education category in the within group standard deviation. So this variance model is then recalculated in standard deviations. So we see predicted means and predicted standard deviations for each education and country and year group. So looking at these values, as I said, we do two exercises with two different data sets. We have a number of items here in the ISSP. Taxes are too high, income differences are too high. Governments should reduce income differences, more government regulation of business, government spending on environment should go up, family values, patriotism, immigration, and environmental concerns. So you see some of them are traditional left-right items when it comes to taxation and government intervention. And some are more modern, what the political scientists call Galtan items, globalized. I forgot already what it stands for. All variables are coded, such as the higher score indicates a more egalitarian, inclusive, cosmopolitan orientation. So for instance, taxes are too high. If you score high on that, in fact, you're critical to that statement that taxes are too high. You think that taxes are too low, or at least you don't think that taxes are too high. It's maybe not quite the same. In the ESS, we have a couple of overlapping questions, but also different ones. Government should reduce income differences is there as well. Gender equality is there, which is not so different from this scale of family values, actually. Immigration attitudes, pro-EU, pro-refugees, and right-left self-placement. So these are the variables that could structurate the education-vote relationship, because we do that with ESS data. In the second step analysis, when we study the education-vote choice relationship, we want to have an association measure for how strongly education predicts party choice. So in political science, there's this whole literature on party families, and this is one index that has been created in this way. So all these parties that are out there in the European Social Survey, in each national context, is then recoded, reclassified into these party families. Simon Hicks, one of my colleagues at the UI, has done this a lot. He has a paper that I've borrowed their code basically to create those party families. And we have these 3 levels of education: lower secondary or less, upper secondary or some post-secondary, and university, college, basically. So this table has an association in each country year, right? So at each country year, we can predict how strongly education predicts the vote choice. And we measure that by an entropy measure, M. Entropy measures basically tell us to what extent the unpredictability is reduced by adding information. So if we had to guess people's votes, how much of that uncertainty that we know is reduced if we know people's education. So it's an association measure that tells us to what extent education and vote choice are related. It's a very valuable measure. I think there should be another paper on this because M is decomposable, meaning that you can also see to what extent the education-vote relationship is driven by simple left-right orientations or more fine-grained modern versus traditional parties, etc. And that decomposition possibility deserves its own attention, I would think. So in this paper, we try to also pitch M as a good measure to study this association. So we have that M, and we have that M here. It's not so clear in this graph, but MCT. So we have at the level of country time a association parameter between education and the vote, following this table. And we predict that by the size of the gaps at the level of country T and the standard deviation at the level of country T. So if polarization matters, one would expect that a larger gap is associated to a stronger association between education and the vote. And if the standard deviation matters, you would expect that a smaller standard deviation would predict a stronger association with the vote, between education and the vote, right? So we should expect this to be positive, better one, and this we predict to be negative. It's a multi-level framework. We have year random effects across countries and country random effects, just to explain the model in detail. So this is the setup. Okay, let's look at the first results, trends in polarization. I don't go through this table. It's just to illustrate what our approach. So basically we have time and we have those orientations here in the columns, and we have different ways to model the time trend. And what we conclude is that the curvilinear trend that has a curvilinear trend over education categories, so a separate one for each education category, fits the data best, at least in a way that is doable for all variables. And the same is true for the European Social Survey, although it's also true that sometimes we can get even a better fit if we don't have any parametrical approach to education. We let it vary by each survey year. But we don't explore that in this particular, in the results now. So we have curvilinear trends over time, and those curvilinear trends are separately estimated by education. So these are the long-term trends when it comes to classical left-right issues in the ISSP data. As you saw, there were like seven types of outcomes. So I just present here two that tell most of the story. Two on the left-right, the classical left-right items, and two more on the modern Galton types of items. But indeed, what is the findings? These are the most clear findings, I think. But it's still not so clear what is happening here. So we see, first of all, if we look at the period after 2000, that there's an increase in the concern of governments to be more involved in economic redistribution. These are different education groups. The highest education group is the lowest score here, so less in favor of redistribution. Yet it's going up as well in all education groups, and the gaps are in fact decreasing. They're larger in the middle of the time frame, which is around 2000, but they're smaller getting later into the time frame. So the gaps are not increasing. They're increasing here, but not so much in the last 20 years, so to say. They're rather decreasing. And something similar you see in the statement on taxes are too high. Again, recoded in the sense that high scores indicate a disagreement with this item. So these are the means, and these are the, oh, this is not correct. These are the variances. So these are the within group variances. And so you see that the within group variance is going down as predicted. So the within group variance is going down, meaning that groups are becoming more similar over time. And that is the same for this item. It's a pity that I didn't correct this label because I had the whole graph, but it was too big. So I selected one, but then this is definitely the variance. So the variance goes down over both of these variables, economic distribution and taxes are too high. But at the same time, okay, this within group homogenization is happening, but also the between group homogenization is happening. So we don't really see that there's polarization because as DiMaggio said, you need both, right? You need both a gap and trenches for polarization to be happening. Yet we also see a lot of variation over time and over countries also in these levels of dispersions. And that is the next step is then of course to see how that relates to the vote choice. When it comes to the Galton items, so the globalized liberal versus traditional nationalist, something like that. It is other political dimension. We see not so much happening actually over time. So attitudes towards immigration are quite stable across education groups. There seems to be even less concern with the environment rather than more over time, but the trends are not so strong, definitely not so strongly different across the groups. But if anything, the groups are getting closer, it looks like, not wider apart. And here too, we see with regard to environment, some decline in variance, but it's all very, very modest. I would say quite stable. And with regard to immigration, it's in fact increasing when it comes to the lower education group. So their heterogeneity is going up, actually, when it comes to how positive people are about immigration. Also here, not really clearly a trend towards polarization. This is the European Social Survey. I don't go through this in great detail, but here too, we don't really see, I mean, the clearest is perhaps gender equality. In terms of trends, you see gender equality attitudes are going up. At the same time, the within group homogenization is definitely happening. So groups are also more similar within their education groups. So this could be the most in line with polarization, at least, although here the groups are not growing apart either. So this is another one, pro-EU. This is interesting, also relevant for our findings later. We see that there's a declining variance within the university education group. On the whole, people are getting more pro-EU overall education groups, yet the within group variance is only going down for those in university, with the university qualification. Let's go left, right. Yeah, if anything, this is definitely going up in terms of heterogeneity, although not significantly, as you see. It's definitely not going down. And here it's going down a bit, maybe, but you have to look very careful and ignore confidence intervals, etc. So also not so strong in terms of trends. Okay, so that's, the conclusion is not so much that there is a very clear trend towards polarization, if you believe that it's both about the gaps and the trenches. If you believe the trenches in themselves, even in the absence of a trend in gaps, are worth studying, we see some trends in trenches that are pointing towards increased homogenization. It also sometimes goes the other way around, but at least it is there. And this plot is just putting the gaps in the trenches together in a graph to see if they are correlated. And you don't see very strong association between the gaps and the trenches, which is good because then we can add them later, both in our prediction of the vote choice. So we have all these items of the ISSP. We don't really see a pattern here. And the same is true for the European Social Survey. So we don't really see, I mean, so there's some exceptions here, of course, but overall, there's not such a strong relationship between gaps and trenches, and certainly there's enough room for estimating both in the model. So let's go to the second part. How am I doing in the time? Very good. Okay, so with regard to trenches and gaps in trends, I'm not sure if the conclusion is very different from what it used to be. Namely, not so clear what the trend is in terms of polarization. We don't see a clear trend towards polarization, even if we look at it in terms of trenches. If we want to follow DiMaggio saying that it has to happen both the mean and the variance should be there. The mean differences are often decreasing, which is in itself interesting from the perspective of political polarization. And the trenches are sometimes going down. I think on the whole, in the ISSP for sure, they're more going down than up. But the trends are not so clearly different. Yet they are varying across contexts. So to understand how the gaps in the trenches might be predictive of the relevance of education for the vote, it could still be the case that variation in gaps and trenches that we see across time and place is in fact correlated to the strength of the education-vote relationship. So even in the absence of clear trends, it could still be that the covariation is of interest in the sense of understanding the education-vote relationship on the basis of polarization. I think these are two separate questions that should be clearly addressed. And if anything, we might, after then having studied those vote relationships, think more about the implications in terms of trends. So if one thinks that education structures the vote more and more, and I'll show evidence that this is indeed the case. So education becomes a better predictor of the vote choice over time. If that is the case, the question is, why is that the case? Is that because of the values that people have? Or is it something else? Could be all kinds of things other than that. But if it's the values, we should be able to see that the strength of the gaps and the deep depth of the trenches should matter for how strongly education is predicting the vote choice. If, in other words, values are the reason why educational groups vote in a certain way, it could be both the gaps and the trenches that structurates their likelihood to vote in a certain way. Because if the trenches are deep and everybody with the same education has a very similar orientation, it might also become a better predictor of the education vote relationship. Could be through networks, for instance, how this happens, as I mentioned in Baldassari's work. It could be more easy to mobilize politically electorates if education groups are more similar among themselves. So there are several reasons to expect that indeed the educational vote relationship is predicted by how education structures values. There are other explanations too, obviously. There could be many things, economic outcomes that we don't measure, that could be correlated to vote preferences. So I'm not saying that education is fully understood by looking at their values, not at all, but it could be a relevant entry into this understanding. So now let's predict the education-vote relationship. So as I mentioned, we measure the association between education and the vote by this M statistic, an association parameter for each context, how strongly associated education is to the vote. And these are all different countries. In the European Social Survey, this is the time trend since 2002-2023. That's the range of the European Social Survey data. And you see, in most cases, a positive trend in the sense that education more strongly predicts the vote choice over time. The overall trend, I modeled it, is also positive and significant. So there is this trend that overall education predicts vote choice better, but sometimes it doesn't go up. Sometimes it goes down, like Slovenia goes down or almost. Whereas Spain here goes up, Netherlands goes up, Portugal goes up, France goes up, Germany less clear so, Bulgaria goes down. So you see there's this association M, this statistic, and it's also quite low actually, the M statistic. So we do get a bit more information by knowing people's education about their vote choice, but the reduction is marginal. It's like you could almost see this as percentage points. So 4 to 6% of the uncertainty about vote choice is reduced by knowing their education. So it's not super strong, but there is a trend towards more predictability of vote choice by education. So that's the y variable, so to say. Right now we predict this. We want to predict the y variable, the association between education and the vote, by the extent of gaps and the extent of trenches in values. And this is the result of this model. And remember, I've put this graph again here just to, maybe you remember it from a previous slide. This is the model basically we try to estimate education vote moderated by the gaps and the trenches. So what we see here is for each of these value items separately, because they are not covered in all the data all the time, separately, how strongly both the within group SD, standard deviation, homogenization, or heterogeneization actually, and the gap predict the strength of this M. And you see that in the case of classical left-right orientation, so on a scale from 0 to 10, where do you place yourself? 10 is left wing, 0 is right wing. You see that there's a small negative but not significant association between the depth of the trenches and the strength of the relationship. It's negative as expected, namely the smaller the heterogeneity, so the more homogeneity, the smaller heterogeneity, the stronger the education vote relationship. So this one should be, this within group SD should be negative, and the gap should be positive if those gaps predict the education vote relationship. With regard to the gaps, we don't see anything with regard to left-right orientation. So we don't see that in societies where the left-right gap, the left-right orientation is more strongly stratified by education, it also predicts the education vote relationship more. The political science friends of mine, the co-authors, are happy with this result because they don't believe very much in this left-right orientation variable. I don't know if this is a general belief in the political science field, but they were quite critical of this. This is the one on government intervention in the income distribution. Here the opposite is found from what we expected. So we see that within group standard deviations are going up, so the variance goes up within groups, and that leads to a better prediction of this of the education vote relationship. I don't think that makes much sense from our theoretical angle. So it's definitely a falsification of this idea that polarization structures the education vote relationship. And also for the gaps, it's the opposite of what we expected. So this turns out to be negative rather than positive. However, when we come to these cultural values, immigration, pro-EU, and gender equality, the pattern is very much in line with what we expected. So we see that this, with regard to immigration, despite the very large standard error, we see that if the homogenization goes up, or if the heterogeneization goes down, we see a stronger association between education and the vote. So that conforms our theory that polarization is driven by, or educational vote relationship is driven by polarization in terms of, in this case, trenches. And with regard to the gaps, the same thing, also in line with our theory. There's a positive association between the gap in educational, the educational gap in orientation towards immigration and the strength of the education vote relationship. Also in line with our argument. Same thing for pro-EU, negative effect for the within group standard deviation, positive, well, zero effect basically for the gap. And for gender, same thing. Gender is more structurating the vote relationship through the variance than through the gap, it looks like. And we don't find anything for refugees, but it must be said that this is an item that doesn't appear a lot in the European Social Survey. So the time trend is not so easy to find in any case. What does it mean? That, first of all, I think the evidence is stronger. Well, that for the cultural values, as we expected before in other literature, with regard to these cultural values, education is a more strong predictor of the vote relation of the political choices people make, and that value orientation also structures the education vote relationship more when it comes to trenches than when it comes to these gaps. these negative effects, I mean, you can't really compare the effect sizes, but you can definitely look at the significance here, that here it's not significant, here it's not significant. And basically this is a gap, like a mean difference in the orientation between the university and the college dropout or high school dropouts. And this is the within group variance as we've estimated it for each of the groups and then averaged over those country years. So this seems to be more strongly associated, at least more clearly associated to the education-vote relationship. So despite the fact that we didn't find strong trends in line with this polarization idea, we do find that the education-vote relationship is quite well predicted with regard to trenches, at least in the context of these cultural values. So that's, I think, the main finding of this paper now. As I said, we moved from a paper studying the trends, basically, in those values, to a paper that now includes also the vote. And the more we talk about it, the more we like this finding of the vote. And let's see if the ISSP survives in this paper analysis. But in any case, it is important to think of these matters. Okay, let's wrap up a bit. So I think there are trends, if anything, there are trends towards smaller gaps between education groups in values or orientations, and not so much stronger gaps. Or stable gaps, also quite common to find. And we did find some evidence of deeper trenches, depends a bit on the education group. The evidence is not super strong though. So we see that the education-vote relationship went up, right? The trends that we see by country, the average trend is going up, and in most countries it's going up. So that is definitely evidence that education gets a more strong predictor, better predictor of the party people vote for over time. Whether this is not controlled for social class, of course, so we don't know anything about the economic situation, all kinds of other explanations why this could be the case. But it's definitely an empirical fact now, at least I hope, that the education-vote relationship gets stronger over time. It might be that this is better predicted by the within-group variances than it is by the between-group gaps in terms of their orientations. I think that evidence is there, at least when it comes to these cultural values. The increasing homogenization of orientations within education groups, or at least the variation that there is in the homogenization within education groups, is predictive of a strong vote relationship between education and vote. That illustrates that the structuring of this education-vote relationship that's going up might in fact be more in line with these trenches as a predictor than as the gaps as the predictor. It should be noted, by the way, that I've tried to avoid causal language here, because all these variance models are often used, these heteroscedastic regression models are often used to test if the model is okay. Namely, if there is heteroscedasticity, you might have a wrong model. In the 1960s, Blau and Duncan also already looked at it this way. If you have variance that is a function of x, your model might not be right. You might have missed variables. You might have omitted variables, right? It's very well plausible that we have omitted variables when it comes to education. Think of intelligence. There might be an increasing or decreasing, varying, sorting on intelligence in education. And if intelligence also predicts orientations and maybe even the vote, it's definitely not a causal story about education. But that's not super important, actually, when you think of it. So this is not about an intervention whether we should increase education or not to get a certain political outcome. That's not at all the question. The question is, we see a polarization tendency in society. We tend to see it in the media, in the public, and not so much in the values that we've studied. Not only this paper, but many other papers have shown that the gap is not so much increasing over time. Other people have found suggestions to come up with what happens then. Why is it that we think there's an increasing polarization even if we don't find it in the data? Looking at trenches is one contribution to that discussion. And it's only a relevant contribution, one could argue, at least political scientists would argue, if it is also correlated to something that is real, namely the vote. I might, as a sociologist, not fully agree with that, actually. The trend in itself, in terms of values, also in terms of homogenization, is interesting on its own, just like Paul DiMaggio also presented in his work in AGS. Yet I also do see that, of course, it gets more relevance to study these trenches, not only to understand polarization of values, but also to study the real life implications in the political arena. So in that sense, the vote is a super important addition to this kind of thinking. And we might be there. The trenches might be more important than the gaps, and that might have to do with exactly those processes that I mentioned. Political mobilization might be easier if education groups are similar. Networks might be more thinking the same if education gets a smaller dispersion. So knowing that networks are increasingly based on education, if those educational networks are then also very homogeneous when it comes to values, because of these deeper trenches, it matters to understand this from a vote perspective. Also, more generally, I think if you look at the gaps or the trends, if anything, the gaps are not increasing. If anything, the education-vote relationship is increasing. And if anything, it's the trenches more than the gaps that are also getting more deeper rather than wider. So in that sense, I hope at least there's some merit to this idea that we should look at trenches. Thank you.
Now, the way we do it is we'll take two questions and then you answer them. We'll do it in pairs. I think Jorge was first, and I think it was Pau second. Do you raise your hand, Pau? No? Okay. Oh, Luis. Okay. So...
very nice talk. Congratulations. I thought very appealing. But I wonder actually what the extent to which the results are not driven by the way you define your dependent variable in the second part. I mean, the way you define vote, because basically these are 7 5-minutes or 5 5-minutes, I don't know, 6 5. But they all count the same, because basically you are just looking at association, and it doesn't matter whether actually it is stronger in the left or in the right or in the middle. So it's an overall measure. So I wonder whether actually if you dichotomize, say, the scale between left and right, you might actually find that it's more about the gaps than about the homogeneity, internal homogeneity. Because in the end, it might be that education, the homogeneity of education, yes, as you say, and you argue, is more about families or cultural, leanings or liking, but that, the left-right say, more cleavage, maybe more about something else, which is less related to similarities with the others, are more about the interest that people may have in specific issues.
So, I mean, it's a very good... Oh, sorry, yes, sorry. Yeah.
So thank you very much, very stimulating. I was a bit surprised because not knowing anything about political polarization, I assumed that it was something that was on the rise. So I was expecting that both gaps and trenches were going up. So I was surprised. But I find very interesting your last evidence in which the entrenchment of political values is something that explains the association between education and vote. And I was thinking, why could be so? And it came to my mind this phenomenon of the echo chambers, that is the people getting deeper in their sort of political values because there's this political communication through social media, etc., etc. And I was wondering if this could be something that sort of deepen trenches in spite of everything. And perhaps there is information in the European Social Survey on that, which I don't know. That's one thing that came to my mind. Why trenches are more important, or what could it be making trenches sort of a stronger linkage between education and vote? The other thing that came to my mind when as a kind of an alternative explanation for that is inequality, income inequality. Basically, it's very easy. It's put Gini as a control, or something like that. because it may be that the genie is also mediating the relationship between education and vote. And so something to control. So thank you.
Maria and Mark, do you have a question? Yeah, yes, sir. Yeah. So we have Maria and Mark, and then everything will be you.
My first answer now. Huh?
Yeah.
Like that. So, yeah, super interesting question about these party families. So indeed, we don't have any view on the orientation or the vote, the type of vote that is predicted, right? So, so one thought we had is to simplify this party families, even to a dichotomous version. But we didn't think of it from the perspective of knowing what the kind of vote is actually. In the sense that we were just wondering how persistent the findings are when we simplify the types of vote that people can make. But again, from a sort of blind perspective of what that vote would be. And now you suggest we should also look at the vote itself. Like, what is it, more left or is it more right wing as a gap, as predicted by the gap or the trenches? And I think this is a super interesting question. We haven't looked at it this way. And yeah, so we would have to have a whole different perspective. And there might be all kinds of things coming up based on this paper. And this will definitely be one avenue of going. And then Luis, yes, those trenches. So what did you exactly say? So those trenches are getting deeper. Oh yeah, no, exactly. So when you think of this paper ball, so Baldassari and Gelman, I mentioned that paper where it was, they argued that it might seem that we are more polarized because our friends are more like in bubbles, like the echo chambers that you mentioned. They say that it could be the case that even if education is not increasingly predicting values, the fact that you now have more echo chambers where you just listen to your own type, so to say, through networks or echo chambers or whatever is the mechanism, then it might look as if there's more polarization, even if there isn't. And our implication, I would say, in relation to that kind of finding of networks and bubbles, would be that even if the mean values don't change over time with education groups, if those bubbles exist, and increasingly so, it could lead to more homogenization of the values that explains why those bubbles matter. So unlike what Baldassari concluded, namely that it might seem as if there's polarization even if there isn't, with regard to trenches, I would say there might be polarization simply because of this homogenization of networks. So in that sense, I'm fully in line with that kind of thinking, actually. Then your second question about contextual variables. We've thought about this. We've done a bit of analysis on this, more in relation to globalization, because there's this winners and losers of globalization kind of debate. Yeah, it's way too much for this paper, but it's definitely something that we want to explore further. It gets a bit more to what Jorge would suggest also, maybe, in terms of the outcomes. So then you would also want to know what is the vote, actually, rather than how dispersed the vote is over education groups. But that's definitely something that we want to go into later. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I very much like the idea about gaps and trenches, like to differentiate between the two. I have a question, just out of curiosity, whether you looked into the specific countries and whether you can tell us more about differences in the results across countries, because what you just showed was, right, the overall effects, and maybe some countries are more pronounced in the gaps and trenches than others. And the second question was about values, because you talked a lot about values. I know scholars that would disagree, right, that they would say it's political orientation or social preference, political preference. So maybe you can say something about that on your stand, like from your point of view, what's value, what's attitude, what's political orientation?
Yes.
Thanks.
Oh, sorry. Yeah,
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I wanted to go back for a moment to the beginning of your talk when you mentioned this more Marxist tradition and the research on social class. And I was wondering to what extent, or maybe if you could clarify this point. I know that you refuse this causal language, but we can still wonder what are you capturing with these categories of education, and how these categories are related to social class in the end. And there is all this literature that I ignore basically, but there is all this literature on the connection between class and education. And I remember that many authors were using the educational levels as a proxy for basically for social class. So it's just a broad question on how to relate what you are measuring through education, if you are measuring education or basically class stratification of these societies in these countries.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. First, the question about countries. I don't know anything about the particular country. I can't say anything about the particular countries that we studied at this moment. So I have to disappoint you in that on your first question. In the paper, we would definitely have, let's say, an appendix or something that would tell us a bit more about the descriptives of this. But I just don't know by heart or anything like that. One question that we've dealt with, and I'm not sure what to do with this, is so of course the ISSP goes back to 1985, but countries come and go, and especially come. So there's more countries over time, meaning that it's uncertain how to model the time trend. So what I showed you now are just balanced panels. So even if we have 52 countries, there's no analysis that has 52 countries, right? Because we just have countries that have consistently taken part in all those waves where they measured that particular item. So the environmental items or other items by item. So that is not ideal. At the same time, it's the safest option when you study trends. So you don't see trends that are just a consequence of new countries emerging, right? So that's of course the risk. But with a certain fixed effects design, we could even maybe alleviate that and include as much as we can. But that's all I can say about countries. Then about labeling the values, as you've seen, I've adapted the title to avoid the word values because of exactly this discussion. I also agree with that actually, that these are not values, at least most of them. I think the safest bet would be to use political orientation or political attitudes. It's definitely maybe the way to go. And I think I also used that label now in the title. And when I used values, I might have to reduce that use more. So I think this is well taken. Then when it comes to social class, I think this is a super relevant question, but I don't think it really fits into this kind of paper, but it fits in my thinking of value formation for sure, or orientation. Namely, so I did a paper a long time ago with Nandek de Graaf as a basically spin-off of my PhD thesis, where we argued or we tested whether class was a better predictor for economic outcomes and education was a better predictor for the more cultural outcomes. And we found support for that. So in terms of survey correlation, so to say, there was a stronger in Dutch, I think Dutch survey, there was a stronger association between class and redistribution attitudes, etc., than with education, and the other way around for orientations towards gender and immigration. So I think it's very clearly there are very clearly different theories why class and education might affect political orientations actually. So in my thesis, and this is what is now being replicated in the US by these political scientists, I had this argument that in education, when you choose a certain field of study, you choose a certain package of skills that you get in that education. And that could include communicative skills. These are skills to understand other people's position. And those were the skills, especially, that predict left-wing orientations more. That has nothing to do with class position. It really has to do with what you learned in school. Whether this is a causal theory is hard to determine. So now I'm working with a PhD student at the UI who has perfect data on one university in the US where you know exactly which courses people take over the course of their 4-year bachelor program. And the expectation then would be that if there's an increase in the number of courses in the social sciences and humanities, one would expect that those students would become more liberal, more left-leaning in over the time of their studies. The first results don't point in that direction. So it looks more that it's about selection, why some people choose social science courses and others choose engineering courses, than about the causal effect of those programs. So that's a more general, issue that I have to find my position in. I'm not sure where I stand when it comes to the causal effect of education in itself on political orientation. I also have a paper with Amsterdam PhD students, fee finished, but in a political science journal where we show that there's no causal effect of education on globalization attitudes and pro-EU attitudes. It's all, it's not causal in that design. So I'm sympathetic to the claim that it might be less causal than we think. But the question is, what does it mean for this? Because it might still be that polarization is real. Even if it's not causally caused by education, it is structured in a way that education groups are visible and meet each other, etc. Even if it's the class background or intelligence or whatever it is that then creates that relationship. So I don't think you should have. You need to have a very strong causal interpretation of education for the cleavages to matter in a political discussion. But that's my personal opinion about this.
It's a very neat paper. Could you scroll down to your conclusions, please?
Word. Oh no, this is the extra slide with that. And this is the thank you slide.
Yeah. So you say that it doesn't match the trend in education-based voting. Shouldn't you adjust for voter turnout there? Because the degree of education effect ought to be correlated very much with the degree of voter turnout in those. I think this is based on the ISS data, right? Exactly. You have 23 countries, right? So there's a lot of difference in voter turnout, even if you only have that 1 year observation window.
Hey, this is a great point. Oh, sorry.
Okay. We do it because it's more efficient, but go if you have the answer in the tip of your tongue, go for it.
Yeah, it can take time to.
My question relates to the first part of your presentation, this deepening trenches. I'm wondering, what is your opinion about the reasons for these deepening trenches? Is it due to the overall convergence in political parties, ideological convergence that is observed during the last 30 years? Well, probably it's due to the expansion of overall educational expansion, and in this case, education is playing more and more sorting role, thus deepening these trenches and making this education group more homogeneous. Or probably to the contrary, more educated people are inclined to support these leftist and these libertarian values, and probably this more education expansion contributed to this homogeneity on this basis. Or probably it's something about general intergenerational change, as younger people for some reason could be more homogeneous in their values. I would doubt this, but probably it's something interesting in this part. And one additional question, just to know, do you control for some educational institutions as a country level variables? As you show, the tracking is quite important in terms of defining the political participation and political attitudes and political involvement. So yes, thanks.
All right, these are super important points and very good suggestions. First, voter turnout question of Justa. I think this is a great point. we have to think about how to deal with this. This could indeed be a control variable, so to say, but it could also be an interesting variable on its own as that gets even closer to my initial interest in studying politics. Namely, it's about participation. So it could be an outcome on its own that is interesting in relation to the education and the gaps in the trenches. If there's more mobilization, if mobilization is easier, it means that it's not only easier to mobilize people for a certain party, but to attract them to politics. If networks matter and they get more homogeneous and your friends go to vote, you might be more likely to go to vote as an outcome. So I would think more in that direction because, of course, when you think about this dilemma that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk between, let's say, democratic equality and meritocratic inequality, I think that dilemma is really not about the political orientation, left or right, but it's about participation, right? A good society, so to say, might be a society where everybody goes to vote, but it's not a society where everybody goes to vote for a certain party. We don't want to have that claim, I would argue. So that in itself makes voting turnout and a super interesting variable. And indeed, it could be, as you said, a control variable because it might drive the relationship in ways that might correlate with the depth in the trenches. But it could also be an outcome on its own right. And I think this is something that you have to think about. Thank you. Then your question about how to explain the trends and the trenches, I think many of these points you raised are super relevant. I would tend to think that especially the idea of expansion, both in relation to the let's say the selection in education and the extent to which this comes with social mobility, might in fact be quite important. And I think there might even be some sort of a counter trend in regards to the gaps in the trenches that comes from the fact that there's more social mobility in education. So if now the university students are of a wider set of origins than they used to be, one would expect a wider orientation among university graduates, right? Instead of a smaller set of orientations. So it counters the overall tendency of trenches, and the fact that I don't observe a clear trend in some cases might in fact be due that I don't control very well for this, let's say, counter trend in terms of heterogeneity. So your question makes me think to include more on social mobility into this approach. It comes down to social background, but it might also come down to the types of students that enter university with regard to their learning abilities. There is a tendency with expansion towards, let's say, also less strong selection in education on the basis of intelligence or academic performance, which could be in many ways a very positive trend, but it might also mean that also in that regard, the groups get more diverse when it comes to political orientations. So I think these are great points, and I think much of what you said falls into that kind of thinking of other trends that could explain the trend. In my view, maybe in opposing ways as my theory would predict. So controlling for it might in fact show it better. So that's a great point also. Thank you.
Herman, I also, like Simone, pretty much like this idea of distinguishing, trends in gaps, average gaps, and variation within the groups. And as far as understood, according to DiMaggio as well, polarization is when gaps increases and variation within groups decreases. But I'm thinking, is there any scope to think of a theoretical scenario where, regardless of the gaps, the variation within one group is decreasing and in the other group is increasing? Because in that case, I think this speaks to a substantive scenario that you could have, is a difference between having two groups, one against each other. They recognize themselves as enemies, if you will. And this is different from a situation in which there is one group against the other group, but then the other group simply, they don't mind them, This is, for them is not, yeah.
Somewhat related. So in in social psychology, we talk about how the reduction of within group differences is dangerous because it leads to groupthink. It leads to this biases of all kinds. I mean, it's not in-group biases. So my question is more about something you mentioned through your presentation, which you kind of alluded to, that you thought that was not a good thing. Obviously, you have to then test what does it predict and why does it matter, and you show that that predicted the link between education and vote for two cultural values. I guess one was immigration, and I forget what the other one was. Gender. Yeah. So, what are the political dangers of that? Right. I mean, we're talking about population level. We're not talking about real groups, right? Those are not politicians that all of a sudden they're all, they all become increasingly similar within that group. But what are you willing to speculate what the political dangers of that would be beyond just vote? Does it mean that we're learning less from each other? Our networks are becoming so similar. We all agree on everything. We're not learning anything new. I mean, my question is very broad, but who better suited to speculate about this than you? So thank you.
I'm to speculate, but not on the basis of my data. I'm confident. So Giampiero, so I think this is a great question. So what I basically did empirically is to estimate these models with education as a predictor and year and country, etc., and all the interactions. So we have within group variation for each education group separately, right? So there's a prediction of your group, and then you might deviate from that group prediction. But then to get to that analysis on the vote choice, I basically take the average of that country year of those within education group variances, assuming that smaller variances are deeper trenches. And you say, well, this might vary by group. And in fact, related to the previous question of educational expansion and social mobility, I think there's this work by Heike Solga and others who show that the lower educated group gets more homogeneous, actually, with regard to all kinds of, I think it's more about labor market outcomes. But because, with educational expansion, everybody who has a bit of educational opportunities will get to some level of education. So the group that is least educated, is a more negatively selected group over time. That makes them perhaps more homogeneous. We don't find it though, but it might make them more homogeneous within that group. Whereas the group of higher education that gets more diverse in terms of the backgrounds of the students over time might become more heterogeneous. But again, we find, somewhat the opposite. We find smaller heterogeneity among the higher educated groups. So I could of course predict the education-vote relationship with all these separate variances, right? I could do that empirically, but it would get a bit messy, I thought. But maybe I should go that way because it's a relevant question. And it also fits this other line of thinking that, with expansion of education, you see an increasing homogenization among the lower educated groups and an increasing heterogenization with regard to all kinds of background, other factors affecting your orientation. And the more I think of it, if I would be able to control for these kinds of processes, I might find stronger trends than I find actually, because they work in the opposite direction. But again, that's something that I have to think about. Your question about speculating about the political dangers. So one risk of, so if I look at it in a broader perspective, and I'm happy to do that, but again, this is purely, let's say, more political and speculative than empirical. The Netherlands is an interesting case actually about this, because what we've seen is that there's a change from a vertically oriented society to a horizontally oriented society. Vertically as in the word these old pillars, as it has been called, the Catholic, the Protestant, socialist pillars, liberal pillars, and they had the society was very strongly polarized, but that society was able to sustain some sort of cohesion because the elites were able to talk to each other and arrange things for their own constituencies. That's the theory of Arend Leipart, very famous political science approach. That elite pacification, as he called it, has definitely changed, in the sense that now we don't have these pillars anymore where the elites are able to communicate to their constituencies, because now the society is more horizontally organized in several layers that some people call the new pillars, but I don't think these are pillars because they miss exactly that pillars are vertical. So, and there's an increasing segregation across lines of education or income groups or whatever it is, that might make it very hard for politics to arrange, to create social cohesion in a way that everybody feels themselves part of the debate. And I think that is a real problem. That is, I think, a risk when it comes to politics. I think we might explain a lot of polarization in the political arena through this means. There's just too little concern about those who can't take part in society fully or get enough resources. A very nice book by Iverson and Solskjaer a couple of years ago. They say that, big firms don't want to leave our countries as long as we have good societies. If we have good education and people feel part of the developments in society, you can have a world where the economy grows and at the same time you don't have the threat of international capitalism saying that we move our firm. So it takes effort for societies to bring everybody on and make people part of society. And if that's not happening, there is indeed a risk to the democracy, I would argue. But then, again, this is not very strongly based on my tables.
So, unless there's another question, I think we'll close the session. Thank you very much. Thank you.